Welcome back into another edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. My name is Andy Barch with AM 930 WEOL and 100.3 FM. Joined as always by Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and of course, BrownsZone.com. Scott, great to be joined by you as always, and a lot to talk about this week, even though mini camps are canceled, and we won't get the chance to see the Browns on the field for another few weeks here until we get into training camp in July. Things are still pretty busy in Brownstown.
Yeah, they are. The off-season program continues virtually. So we talked to, I'm trying to think, Kevin Stefanski. We talked to Kevin Stefanski, the coach, on Wednesday, and it had been since the draft since we talked to him. So that was interesting. We can get into that a little bit. We talked to Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, the new VP of football operations, on Thursday. Very interesting guy, interesting background, how he came to work in the NFL. And now he's the assistant GM to Andrew Berry, so obviously an important guy in the Browns organization. And then the news of minicamps being officially canceled came Thursday as well. The league said, hey, we're not going to bother trying to have these. There's no players yet allowed back in team facilities. And why we expected this, it kind of hung out there. Maybe they'll be able to get on the field once for a couple of days before training camp, but now that's been removed. And Kevin Stefanski, first-time head coach, he's met some of the players, right? He's met OBJ and Jarvis Landry when they were rehabbing in the facility before the coronavirus pandemic, but he's not met the vast majority of players on his roster. And it will be the start of training camp, which is tentatively scheduled for July 28th, before he meets many of his players, before he addresses them in person, and before he gets on a football field with these guys. And we're going to talk about it a million times once we get to camp and how, and even now, how kind of an obstacle that is and how challenging that is for a first-time head coach. But that's the reality that's set in Thursday with the official cancellation of minicamps. So the Browns are going to continue with the virtual offseason program through June 26th, that week. And then the players will get a break before training camp. But it just shows you, again, it's another example of what an unusual offseason this has been.
We'll also come around and talk about some of the linebackers as well, and, of course, close out with the golf shot of the week. But, Scott, let's begin with a topic that you've already kind of scratched the surface on with the minicamps being canceled. That's not really a big surprise, but it is a pretty big deal as this offseason just continues to be very, very unusual, as we all expected in the midst of a pandemic. As a result of the off-season program continuing the way that it's gone on basically for the past 3 months here, being done so virtually, what are two big concerns of yours as we ramp up the next 6 weeks here and head into training camp?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Bull. Like, you almost have to separate it between football and real life. One of my real-life concerns is how are the Browns and how is the NFL in general going to handle a return of players to their facilities given the pandemic. And Roger Goodell, the commissioner, put out a memo. All the days run together, but I'm pretty sure it was Monday this week. And it was a long 4-page memo with all kinds of regulations and guidelines for the return of players, whenever that is. And now we're looking at training camp. And it talked about making sure the locker room players were 6 feet apart in the locker room. And now that's hard to do because there's, if you talk about now it's a 55-man roster, you have a 10-man practice squad, and then in training camp there's 90 guys in there. There's just not infinite room. So how do you make that work? Do you set up an auxiliary locker room for some of the guys? Weight rooms, you're supposed to limit the personnel in the weight room and have all these cleaning restrictions. And meetings, if you're going to have team meetings over 20 people, that's supposed to be virtual if you can do it. So instead of Kevin Stefanski in front of his room at 7 o'clock in the morning, does everybody have to go maybe to their individual position rooms and do the Zoom calls that way? So there's a lot to digest. And John Harbaugh, the Ravens coach, talked to a radio station, I think, in Baltimore yesterday, and said he doesn't know how that can work. It just doesn't seem possible. And so I just think there's so many layers to go through there and things to unpack. And with the reality being you can only practice and play football if you're right on top of somebody and sweating and breathing, right, in their face. And then you get in a huddle and you're also, you're inches away from each other. And usually you hold hands in the huddle. So, it feels a little contradictory. I understand why the NFL would put these guidelines in place, why the union would fight for them. You want to be as safe as possible. You want to reduce as much risk as possible. But is it realistic? I think those are things that will have to be worked out because these are not final guidelines. So that's one thing that, I plan on writing about this weekend, and it's been kicking around in my head, just exactly how is not only training camp going to look, because I think practices will look pretty similar, but the day-to-day activities of the team, which include, time in the locker room, time in meeting rooms, in the weight room, all those things, right in the cafeteria. They changed the cafeteria rules. So I think there's a lot of moving pieces there, and we'll learn more about that. And then from a football perspective, again, it goes back to this unusual offseason. It's just how far behind are the Browns, given the fact that they haven't been able to practice. And I know what Kevin Stefanski says, right? No team is allowed to practice, so we're in the same boat as everyone else. And I understand that, and I think that's the right attitude to take. And probably the only attitude you can take as a coach. But this is a new staff with new offensive system, new defensive system, a relatively young team, right? You have a third-year quarterback, and there's a bunch of young guys, right? Second-year corner and Greedy Williams, third-year corner and Denzel Ward. And we can go through the list. We're a real young linebacking core that we're going to talk about. And for these coaches not to have seen these players up close, in person, on their field, running their systems, I think is a serious disadvantage for this team and organization. It doesn't mean it can't be overcome, but I just think it means you go into training camp, 1, 2, 3, 4 steps behind teams like the Ravens and the Steelers that have had much more continuity. So I know there's a big picture things, and we're not talking about a quarterback, but that's where I stand as we are 6-7 weeks away from what should be the start of training camp, assuming it doesn't get delayed for any reason.
And you hit on a couple of interesting points there, Scott, too, in that, it's one thing to implement your plan on paper. It's another to apply it on the field. And that's one setback for the Browns here, whereas a lot of other teams, especially in the same division, they've got a leg up here because the personnel and, more importantly, the coaching staff and the schemes haven't necessarily changed as much. And as you alluded to with the Browns, a lot has changed. You're talking about a brand-new coaching staff, a brand-new philosophy. And as a result, again, it's one thing to apply what you have in play on paper as opposed to implementing it on the field. And you can't help but think that that's going to have at least some effect, and that's going to put them at least kind of behind the eight ball, at least in the early stages of the preseason, no?
Yeah, I completely agree, Bull. And, the Browns, all the coaches and all the players we've talked to throughout this virtual offseason program have been consistent in how they believe the program's going well, and they believe the learning and the teaching has been productive, and the system's being in place. And Stefanski said this week they wrap up the installation, and then they start reviewing it. Which is good, and it seems like they're on course there. But they'll admit, and offensive coordinator Alex Van Pelt did admit this last week when we talked to him, now it's time to see guys on the field, right? There's a big step there to having all this kind of conceptualized. And yes, we're putting in this thing, and okay, I understand this, and I can answer the quiz you give me. But then in the heat of the battle, right? And when you have to make a split-second decision, do I run this route or do I cut it off because there's a blitz coming or they're playing zone versus man? You have to make those adjustments on the fly, and that's why coaches love practice. And they love practice time is because they feel you need those repetitions, and the Browns just haven't had those. And we might have mentioned this last week, but I think it's important. Van Pelt talked about how they're going to use Kareem Hunt, right, the versatile running back. He goes, I need to see him on the field to know exactly how he fits in our scheme. I think you can say that about just about every player on the roster, especially offensively, but even defensively. We're going to talk about the linebackers a bit. Coordinator Joe Wood said the same thing about his linebackers. He goes, we're cross-training them and we're telling them to learn different positions. We don't know what any of them can do on the field yet. Well, the Steelers know what their guys can do on the field, right? All but maybe the rookies and a free agent, but even the free agents have played elsewhere. The Browns, this coaching staff has watched a bunch of film on these guys, but it's completely different having your hands on them and watching them try to go through your system. So, yeah, I think that's a huge impediment for this team.
Well, you mentioned that we'll come around to the linebackers. Let's do that now. You wrote a piece on the concerns at that position. Scott, what specifically concerns you most about that entire group?
A lack of proven veterans, I would say. And, maybe I'm just more conservative in the fact that I'd like to see somebody have done it before. And we saw that with Joe Schobert. We saw that with Christian Kirksey. Yes, he dealt with a bunch of injuries in the last couple of years of his career with the Browns, and that's why they cut him, and it made sense to cut him to save salary cap space when they got rid of him in, I think it was February or March. But there was a comfort level, at least it would be for me if I were a coach or a GM. I've seen this guy do this, right? I've seen him have 140 tackles in the league. I've seen him sack Ben Roethlisberger, whatever it is. And now you transition to a group with, B.J. Goodson, a free agent they signed for a one-year deal, is really the only guy with significant NFL experience. I think he started 20-some games. But he's maybe a one-down player. He's a base defense linebacker, even though he thinks he can be more. His career, he's only played 30% of his defensive snaps, which means he leaves the field in passing situations. Yeah, Mack Wilson started, 14 games a year ago, is a rookie and flashed, but I'm not ready to just say, yes, Mack Wilson is my every down linebacker, whether it's middle or weak side. I think I need to see more. I think the coaches need to see more. Taki played 105 snaps, is a rookie last year, and then you drafted Jacob Phillips out of LSU. So not only is there inexperience, like I mentioned a little bit before, they don't know exactly where these guys are going to play. You can say, okay, B.J. Goodson is our middle, and then we'll go Taki on the strong side and Mack Wilson on the weak side. But then what do you do when Goodson leaves the field? You leave a second-year guy to call the defense. All right, that gives me a little bit of concern, makes me uneasy. Do you put Jacob Phillips? You see the rookie. Where does he fit? Andrew Berry, during the draft, said he thought Phillips projected as a weak side linebacker in their 4-3 system. I talked to Dave Aranda, who was Phillips' coordinator at LSU, and he said, I see him as a middle or a strong. So, again, that's another thing where if the Browns had rookie minicamp, if they had OTs, if they had the mandatory minicamp next week, then you would see the coaches would see Jacob Phillips, they'd see Mack Wilson, Taki, how they fit, and have a better idea coming into July in the preseason where they want to start these guys. Now they have an idea, but to me that idea can switch in 5 practices and go, oh, we were wrong. Mack is in the middle. He must play on the weak side. And then you got to revamp things. So to me, that is, when you get to a football perspective, just strictly football, linebacker is my biggest concern about this roster. And I'm not sure that concern goes away before the season starts. And, I still think there's a chance that maybe they bring in another veteran. But Barry and Stefanski were pretty adamant during the draft about they like the youth movement at the position. And maybe that pays off long term, but I think there could be some road bumps along the way.
Scott, you mentioned a bunch of names along the way there and talking about that entire group. Speaking of some of those names, I mean, is there a guy or two in that group that you really kind of feel like could surprise this year?
Well, look at it. Let's count Mack Wilson as kind of a known because he played 14 games last year or started 14 games, and we saw some production. So I'll kind of remove him from that question. I think it has to be Taki. Sione Taki. 3rd-round pick a year ago out of BYU. And Mack Wilson was a 5th-round pick out of Alabama. And he jumped Taki. And part of that was because Taki had a hamstring injury during training camp and missed. Part of it was Christian Kirksey got hurt, and that was the position where Wilson was the backup, as opposed to Taki backed up Schobert, and Schobert was healthy throughout the year. But, you can't waste 3rd-round picks, and there's expectations for those guys. And I know it was a John Dorsey pick and not an Andrew Berry pick, but if you're going to have someone come in and surprise this year, I think the Browns would benefit the most if it were Taki. Now, you can make the same argument for the rookie Jacob Phillips, but it feels like Taki would have the better chance, just given the fact that he was at least around last year, got on the field a little bit defensively, and Phillips is coming in without any real off-season as a rookie. I think it gives Takitaki the advantage if you're looking for a guy that's going to come on and surprise.
Well, that's going to be an interesting group to follow throughout the year, just because there's just so many unknowns in that group. And if that group ends up far exceeding expectations, Scott, I think it's safe to say that could make this defense incredibly good, and that could in turn make this team much, much better than people think, because if you examine every unit on this team, I think it's safe to say that linebacker really kind of stands out as one of the biggest question marks, simply because at other spots of the defense, feels like you've got a lot more in the way of proven commodities. Furthermore, you look at the other side of the ball, I would say that they've got way more in the way of further commodities. So this certainly is a big, big year for this entire group.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And the Browns obviously value linebacker less than they value the defensive line in the secondary. And I understand that. But you just can't ignore it completely. Not that they have, but you just can't. And especially in this division, the AFC North, where teams continue to run the ball, right? You have Joe Mixon in Cincinnati. You have Lamar Jackson and Mark Ingram and now J.K. Dobbins, right? With the Ravens, they're going to run the ball a ton. We know that. The Steelers historically run the ball. We know what the weather's like in this division, all that. I'm telling fans things they already know. You need to be able to stop the run in this division. No matter how football has changed, in this division, you need to stop the run. The Browns have always been bad at that since they've been back in 1999. And you can't be good at stopping the run if you're bad at linebacker. I just think it's that simple. So while it might not be as important as getting to the quarterback and guarding the receivers, it's still crucial, and you need good linebacker play. I don't think there's any way around it.
Well, at the very beginning of the podcast, we had talked about this. I know that this is something you'd love to hit on, the conversation that you had with Assistant General Manager and VP of Football Operations, Kwefi Adofo-Mensah. You also didn't butcher that once, so a tip of the old cap to you, sir, for nailing that every single time you brought the name up. But this is a guy with a pretty interesting background. What were some of your major takeaways in your conversation with him?
Yeah, there were plenty, but I'll give you a couple. Number one, from a football perspective, is he comes from the 49ers, and he was, I think his title was Director of Research and Development, which is an interesting title, right? It speaks to analytics, it speaks to projects, not so much a scouting background. And he said one of the things that he did in San Francisco was study other sports teams, sports organizations, and companies, the successful ones, and try to figure out why they were successful, right? And we talk so much about culture, and the Browns have lacked culture, and obviously they've lacked success. And he did this project, and he studied, and he said, number one, it's important to have your belief system and then not waver from that, and to know we're doing it the right way, so even if things don't work, you stick to your plan, and you have faith in that plan. And he said that showed up with the 49ers because they went to the Super Bowl last season, right, and lost to the Chiefs. The year before, I think they were 4-12 because the quarterback got hurt. They had issues. And we're talking a young coach, a first-time coach in Kyle Shanahan, first-time GM in John Lynch, and weaker franchises, weaker organizations. The Haslam's, I think, have been guilty of this, could have panicked and said, we're going to start over. These aren't the right guys, right? They had and I think they were 4-12 in Shanahan and Lynch's second season. So that's when they were supposed to make a jump. Yet they knew that the foundation was right. They knew that if their quarterback got healthy, they could be better. They knew, or believed at least, they had the right coach. And they go on and they have an incredible season last year and go to the Super Bowl. And people expect them to be great again because of all these things in place and the proper culture and all that. So he brings a winning experience, number one, and he said, I know what winning, I'm paraphrasing, I know what winning football looks like, and I'm never going to waver from that, which means he's going to fight for doing the right thing. And I think that is crucial for an organization that has such a poor history, right, win-loss record of the Browns, and the fact that they've changed. And Jimmy Haslam has been known to kind of move with the wind, whichever way the wind's blowing, to have steady forces like Kwesi, like Paul DePodesta, like GM Andrew Berry, hopefully, I think can have a significant impact on the organization. And the second takeaway is he said, and I don't want to butcher this quote, so I'm going to paraphrase it, that he's kind of he's always enjoyed making decisions in uncertain circumstances. Okay, I don't have my laptop in front of me, but that's the gist of it. And what he means is whether or not he was playing basketball at Princeton as a walk-on, or whether when he was on Wall Street as a commodities trader, or at Stanford getting his master's in economics, or in the NFL, you have to all you do is make decisions. And the circumstances change, and you don't have all the information. It's almost like Texas Hold'em. It's a partial information game, and you have to do as much as you can with the information you're given. And he said it applies to commodities trading, right? You have to take a risk, and you have all this information, but the field kind of moves on you, and you have to make a quick decision, and you have to trust your instinct. You have to trust your information and make difficult decisions in tough spots. And the same goes for the draft. You don't know that player X is going to work out to be a star, but you take all your information, you believe the process you went through is correct, and then you go ahead and pull the trigger on that decision. He said that the thought processes are similar from commodities trading to the draft, to pulling off an NFL trade. And I thought that was really interesting. And he said he loves being in that spot. And I just thought that was fascinating. And I think that speaks to him and his knowledge and his ability to think on his feet and all those things. And that's how you have an economics degree from Princeton and a master's from Stanford.
Certainly an interesting background, and it'll be really interesting to see how that entire group works together and to see just how long of a leash they're going to get as well, because as we know, the ownership certainly has not shown the propensity to give these groups much time to work things out, especially when things go south early on. All right, Scott. In future episodes, we will certainly have the opportunity to break down some of the positions before we get into training camp and maybe take a look at the schedule as well. But we will attack those in future episodes before training camp begins. We wrap up today's show by taking a look at your golf shot of the week. Everybody's excited because live golf is back on TV again, and everybody's getting out on the links right now. Beautiful weekend here in the greater Cleveland area. I know you'll have the opportunity to do some golf a little bit later on this weekend. What are your golf shots of the week?
You know what, Bo, before I get there, something popped into my head as we were talking, and I thought it'd be negligent if I didn't bring it up. We did talk to Kevin Stefanski this week. And one of the big takeaways, and I won't belabor this, but, there's been so much talk about racial injustice and the George Floyd killing. And he made a point of how that's been a constant conversation within these virtual meetings. He's brought in guest speakers. He even attended his first protest in Avon last Saturday. He took his two young boys. His mom was in town. She went with him. And he just wanted to make the point of he's encouraging the players to get in the arena, to not just talk about change that needs to be made, but do something about it. And he believes the organization here providing resources to these players so they can take the appropriate action. And, he wanted to deflect the spotlight from himself, but he said it's so important to attach your name, how he put it, and still got that phrase from Anquan Bolden. He just wants people to know that you need to take action. And by going to the protests and by doing other things, he has started to take that. He is proud of his players for doing the same. I just thought that was one of the bigger stories of the week, and I'd forgotten it until a minute ago. But getting back to golf, you're 100% right. It's a great weekend. I got a tee time Friday. I got a tee time Sunday. I watched a bunch of golf yesterday, even though there's no fans. I love it. I could watch golf all day long. And we're talking about my golf shots of the week. I only played once last week, and it was not a particularly good round. I played at Pleasant Valley in Medina, one of my go-to spots. But as always, there's a shot or two that are memorable or worth talking about, make you want to come back. So I'll give you two quick ones. Number 5 at Pleasant Valley, it's a par 4, and there's water. There's a pond right in front of the green. I popped up my tee shot. I had about 190, I want to say, left. So that's a long shot. The water's right in front of the green. If you don't hit it solid, you're going in the water. and I had a solid 4-iron out of the rough, carried landed on the green and took out off the back. So that made me feel good. It was a solid iron. It might have been the first or second solid iron of the day that I hit. And then on the back 9, number 12. And it's interesting because the last time I played there, we were having a discussion with the two guys I played with, and I think it's the toughest hole on the course. And I think on the scorecard, it's the second toughest hole on the course, handicap-wise. But I played there hundreds of times, and it's just a tough hole for me, and it's because the driving area is so narrow. Trees on the left, trees on the right, and I tend to spray it off the tee a little bit. You don't really have a whole lot of room to cut it if you want to play the fade that I tend to play. Anyway, I got up on the first tee, or on the 12th tee, and I hit as good a drive as I can hit. It started left, it faded 5 or 10 yards, took a big hop, rolled down the fairway to 100 whatever yards. I had a wedge into the green. It made me feel good that I could actually stand on the tee and hit a tough drive and a tough spot. Not when I needed to. I wasn't playing for money or anything. It was by myself, but just hit a good drive when you wanted to hit a good drive. Now, I couldn't get up and down for par after I pulled the wedge, but the drive is good. And when I go to the number 1 tee in Bunker Hill in about half an hour, I'm going to try to think about the tee shot I hit at number 12 at Pleasant Valley.
Positive thoughts in the tee box, right? That's what you're looking for, confidence and positive thoughts when you're in the tee box. And it sounds like that's exactly what that last golf shot did for you.
That's exactly right. I mean, negative thoughts are tough to get those out of your head, but if you can keep a positive one in there every once in a while, you're heading in the right direction.
Good stuff. Well, Scott, as always, great to catch up. And as we put the wraps on another edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage podcast, we'll still have plenty to cover in the weeks to come, as we are, hard to believe, but just about 6 weeks away from training camp. Scott, thanks as always for the time.
Hey, thanks, Bulls. Great.
Thank you, Scott. Again, that's Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter for the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and, of course, at BrownsZone.com. That'll wrap things up on today's edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Barch saying thanks again for tuning in, and we will talk to all of you again next week.